Pennsylvania, 1945. Thomas Mitchell's farmhouse stood white against the green hills, its windows glowing warm in the October dusk. Inside, 7 German women sat at his dinner table, their prison uniforms replaced with borrowed dresses, their hands folded in their laps, uncertain. They had been enemies 3 months ago. They had expected internment camps and guard towers. Instead, this widowed schoolteacher from Lancaster County had requested them for a harvest work program and brought them into his home. What happened over the next 6 months would challenge everything both sides believed about nationality, loyalty, and what it meant to be human. Thomas Mitchell was 48 years old in the autumn of 1945, a widower, a history teacher at Lancaster County High School who had taught the same classroom for 22 years. His students remembered him as stern but compassionate, someone who demanded critical thinking and rewarded honest intellectual effort with genuine respect. He lived alone in his family's farmhouse, 3 miles outside town on land his grandfather had cleared in the 1870s. House was substantial 2 stories, 6 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough to feed a dozen workers during harvest season. His wife Margaret had died in 1941 from pneumonia, leaving him with rooms that echoed and a silence that grew heavier each year. The war had touched his life directly. 2 former students had died at Normandy. Another lost a leg in the Ardennes. Thomas followed the conflict with the analytical mind of a historian who understood that he was watching the world remake itself, that whatever emerged from this fire would be fundamentally different from what had entered it. Then, in September 1945, the war ended and the question of what to do with thousands of German prisoners became urgent. The military needed workers for the autumn harvest American farms were short-handed after years of men serving overseas. A program was established allowing vetted prisoners to work on civilian farms under supervision. Thomas heard about it at a teachers' meeting. Principal Morrison mentioned that several local farms were participating, that it was controversial but necessary, that the prisoners were strictly monitored and posed no threat. That evening, alone in his study, Thomas made a decision that would alter 8 lives permanently. He contacted the regional administrator and requested workers for his farm. When asked his preference, he specified women prisoners, auxiliary personnel, non-combat roles. The administrator was surprised. Most requests came from large commercial operations. Thomas Mitchell's farm was small, barely profitable, more of a homestead than a business. And requesting women prisoners when a single male lived alone raised eyebrows and questions about propriety. But Thomas's credentials were impeccable teacher, veteran of the previous war, property owner, respected community member. He explained his reasoning carefully. Women prisoners were less likely to be viewed as threats by neighbors. His farm work was not physically demanding, and as a teacher, he was interested in the re-education aspect of the program. The administrator made notes, asked more questions, and eventually approved the request with conditions: regular inspections, weekly reports, and a local chaperone to address any concerns about impropriety. 2 weeks later, a military truck delivered 7 German women to his front door. The truck arrived at 4 in the afternoon, dust rising behind it on the gravel drive. Thomas stood on the porch, jacket buttoned despite the warmth, watching as an army sergeant helped the women climb down from the truck bed. They looked younger than he had expected. Early 20s, most of them, wearing surplus civilian clothes that didn't quite fit, dresses too large, shoes too small, everything slightly wrong. They stood in a loose line, heads down, shoulders hunched inward, the body language of people expecting punishment. The sergeant approached with paperwork. His name was Collins, and he had the weary professionalism of someone who had been doing this job too long. 7 prisoners as requested, Mr. Mitchell. All auxiliary personnel, non-combat roles. Cleared for agricultural work. He handed over a folder. Their documentation, medical records, work assignments. You'll need to sign here. Thomas signed, his hand steady despite the strangeness of the moment. He was taking custody of 7 human beings, who months ago had been serving a regime dedicated to everything he opposed. Collins continued his briefing. I'll be checking in weekly. They're to remain on your property, except for designated work areas. No contact with other prisoners. No unsupervised interaction with civilians. Any problems? You call the number in that folder immediately. Thomas nodded, only half listening. He was watching the women, trying to read their faces, their postures, trying to understand what they were thinking and feeling. "One more thing," Collins said, lowering his voice. "The chaperone requirement. Mrs. Yoder from the church has agreed to visit 3 times weekly to ensure everything's appropriate." The implication was clear. A single man housing 7 young women, even enemy prisoners, raised concerns about morality and propriety that 1945 Pennsylvania took seriously. "I understand," Thomas said. "Mrs. Yoder is welcome any time." Collins returned to the truck, and suddenly Thomas was alone with 7 German women on his front lawn. The late afternoon sun slanted across the porch. Somewhere in the orchard, birds were settling for evening. The moment stretched, uncomfortable and uncertain. Thomas cleared his throat. "Does anyone speak English?" One woman stepped forward slightly. She was tall, angular, with dark hair pulled severely back. Her eyes met his briefly before dropping again to the ground. "I speak some English," she said, her accent thick but her grammar correct. "I am Helene. I was translator in auxiliary corps." "Thank you, Helene." Thomas gestured toward the house. "Please tell the others they're welcome. Come inside. I'll show you where you'll be staying." Helene translated rapidly in German. The women exchanged glances, but didn't move. Years of military discipline and propaganda had taught them that entering an enemy's home was dangerous, that Americans were unpredictable, that safety lay in obedience and distance. Thomas recognized their hesitation. He had seen it before, in students who had been taught to fear learning, who protected themselves through passivity. "I'm a teacher," he said to Helene. "History. I've taught high school for more than 20 years. This is my home, and while you're here, I'll treat you as I would treat any guests who needed shelter." Helene translated. Something shifted in the women's postures, not trust exactly, but a fractional reduction in tension. One by one, they picked up their small bags and followed Thomas into the house. The farmhouse's interior was clean, but clearly the domain of someone who lived alone. Books everywhere on shelves, stacked on tables, marking spaces where a man spent his solitary evenings. The furniture was well maintained, but old, dark wood from another era. Photographs lined the mantel. A younger Thomas with a woman who must have been his wife, both smiling, her hand on his shoulder. Thomas led them upstairs. 3 bedrooms had been prepared, 2 with 2 beds each, 1 with 3. Fresh linens, clean windows, late afternoon sunlight, making everything warm. "You'll sleep here," he explained through Helene. "Bathroom is at the end of the hall. Dinner will be ready in an hour. Please rest, wash up, and come down when you're ready." He left them alone. The women stood in the hallway, uncertain, whispering among themselves in German. Helene watched Thomas descend the stairs, his back straight, his movements careful and deliberate. She couldn't reconcile this man, this quiet, polite teacher, with the monsters the regime's propaganda had described. Downstairs, Thomas began preparing dinner. He was a competent cook, having learned from necessity after Margaret's death. Tonight he had planned something simple: roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans from the garden, fresh bread from the bakery in town. As he worked, he thought about what he was doing, the strangeness and weight of it. 7 German women, former members of military auxiliary forces, now sleeping in his guest rooms. His neighbors would talk. Some would disapprove. But Thomas had learned something in his years of teaching history, that ideology blinds people to humanity, that the only antidote is direct, honest human contact. These women had served a terrible system, but they were also individuals who had been caught in circumstances beyond their control, who had believed lies because lies were all they heard, who were now displaced, defeated, and frightened. If he could show them something different, not through lectures or propaganda, but through simple daily kindness, perhaps that would matter more than any re-education program could achieve. Upstairs, the women explored their rooms cautiously. Everything was clean, comfortable, almost luxurious compared to the camps they had expected. There were books on the knitstands, fresh flowers in vases, curtains that moved gently in the breeze from open windows. Greta, a former communications operator from Hamburg, sat on one of the beds and felt its softness. In the camps, they had slept on wooden bunks with thin mattresses. Here was a real bed with pillows and quilts. She looked at the others, saw her own confusion reflected in their faces. "What is this place?" whispered Marguerite, 19, who had operated switchboards in Munich. "Why does he have flowers in our rooms?" "He said he's a teacher," Helene answered slowly. "Maybe that means something different here than it did in Germany." Another woman, Liesel, walked to the window and looked out at the farm. Fields stretched toward tree lines, a barn with red paint fading to rust, chickens pecking in a yard. It looked like farms she had known in Bavaria, ordinary and peaceful, bearing no resemblance to the hostile foreign land she had been taught to fear. When the dinner bell rang, an actual bell, hung by the back door, they descended the stairs together, a defensive unit moving through uncertain territory. The dining room table had been set for 8. Plates, silverware, cloth napkins, water glasses. At the head of the table, Thomas stood waiting. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chairs. They sat, backs straight, hands in laps, eyes forward. Prison discipline had taught them to wait, to take nothing without permission. Thomas noticed and understood. He sat at his own place, filled his plate, and began eating normally, as if this were an ordinary dinner with ordinary guests. "Please," he said again, nodding toward the serving dishes. "Help yourselves. There's plenty." Helene translated. Slowly, carefully, the women began taking food. Small portions at first, as if testing whether this abundance was real or illusory. The chicken was tender, perfectly seasoned. The potatoes had butter and herbs. The bread was still warm. Greta took her first bite and felt tears prick her eyes. It had been so long since she had eaten food prepared with care, presented with dignity, offered without degradation. She chewed slowly, savoring every sensation, and tried not to cry. Around the table, the others were having similar experiences. Food became more than nutrition. It became evidence of something unexpected, some quality of civilization they had been told Americans lacked. Thomas ate quietly, watching without appearing to watch, giving them space to process this first encounter. Finally, he spoke. "I know you're wondering what happens now, what the rules are, what I expect." He paused while Helene translated. "Here is what you need to know. You'll work on this farm during the day. Reasonable hours, reasonable labor. In the evenings, you're free to rest, read, write letters home if you wish. I'll provide meals, shelter, and fair treatment. In return, I ask for honest work and respectful behavior." He looked at each woman in turn, his gaze direct but not harsh. "I also want you to understand something else. I'm a teacher. That means I believe in education, in the possibility that people can learn and grow and change their minds when presented with new information. You've been taught things about Americans, about democracy, about the world outside Germany. Some of those things were true. Many were not. While you're here, you'll see for yourselves what's true and what was lies." Helene translated, stumbling slightly over some phrases, but conveying the essence. The women listened with expressions carefully neutral, trained not to react, not to reveal what they were thinking. "I'm not asking you to agree with me," Thomas continued. "I'm not asking you to renounce anything or adopt new beliefs. I'm simply asking you to observe, to think, and to be honest with yourselves about what you see. Can you do that?" After Helene finished translating, silence held for several seconds. Then Greta, surprising herself, spoke in halting English. "We observe, we see, but we do not understand yet." Thomas smiled slightly. "That's a good start. Understanding takes time." The days developed a rhythm. Dawn brought Thomas downstairs to start breakfast coffee, eggs, toast, sometimes pancakes or oatmeal. The women descended one by one, still uncertain, still formal, but gradually less fearful. After breakfast, they worked. Thomas's farm was modest 20 acres of crops, a small orchard, a vegetable garden, chickens, and 2 dairy cows. The harvest needed bringing in: apples to be picked, corn to be cut, potatoes to be dug. It was hard work, but not brutal, and Thomas worked alongside them, showing rather than ordering, offering breaks when anyone looked tired. Liesel, who had grown up on a farm in Bavaria, took to the orchard work naturally. She showed the others how to judge apple ripeness, how to twist the fruit free without damaging the branch. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and for the first time since capture, she felt competent useful, like herself. Marguerite worked in the vegetable garden with Greta, pulling onions and carrots, filling baskets with produce. The soil was different from German soil, darker, richer, but the work was the same. Pull, shake free of dirt, place in basket. Simple, rhythmic, almost meditative. During a mid-morning break, Thomas brought out water and apple slices. The women sat in the shade of the barn, grateful for rest, drinking deeply. "How long were you in the auxiliary forces?" Thomas asked Helene, who had become the de facto spokesperson for the group. 2 years, she answered. "Since 1943, I translate communications, work with radio operations. Did you want to join, or were you conscripted?" Helene considered the question carefully. "Both, maybe." There was pressure to serve, to show loyalty. But also, we believe, she struggled for words. We believe it was necessary. For Germany, Thomas nodded, not arguing, just listening. "And now? What do you believe now?" Helene's face tightened. "Now I do not know what I believe. Everything is confused. This honesty, this admission of uncertainty, was more than Thomas had hoped for so early. It meant she was thinking, questioning, allowing reality to complicate her previous certainties. "That's the hardest part," he said quietly. "Realizing that what you thought was true might not be. It's painful. But it's also the beginning of real understanding." Mrs. Yoder arrived that afternoon for her first inspection. She was 65, devout, and deeply suspicious of the entire arrangement. She moved through the house, examining sleeping quarters, checking that propriety was being maintained, her mouth set in a line of perpetual disapproval. "They're sleeping comfortably," she observed, as if this were somehow problematic. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "They're working hard. They deserve rest." "People are talking, Thomas. A single man, 7 young women, even if they are prisoners. Let them talk. Nothing inappropriate is happening here, and you'll report that accurately." Mrs. Yoder sniffed, but couldn't deny what she observed. A household running with decorum, workers being treated fairly, nothing suggesting impropriety or danger. She left with promises to return in 3 days, her skepticism intact, but her concerns about immediate scandal somewhat allayed. That evening, after dinner, Thomas did something unexpected. He invited the women into his study. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books. History, philosophy, literature, mathematics, English, and some German titles, volumes that had clearly been read and reread. A globe stood in one corner. Maps covered one wall: Europe, Asia, the Pacific, marked with pins tracking the war's progress. "I thought you might like to read," Thomas said. "If you're interested. The German books are there." He pointed to a shelf. Goethe, Schiller, Heine, Mann. All of it acquired before the war. The women stared at the books as if they were treasures. In the camps, reading material had been scarce and heavily censored. Here was literature, real literature, including authors the regime had deemed problematic or decadent. Helene moved to the shelf, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the spine of a Heine collection. "You have Heine?" "Of course, great poet. The regime burning books doesn't make them less valuable." Helene pulled the volume down, opened it reverently. Inside, someone, probably Thomas, had written annotations in German, thoughtful marginal notes, engaging with the poetry. She looked up at him, questions forming that she couldn't quite articulate. "Take whatever you'd like," Thomas said. "Read, think, discuss among yourselves if you want. The books exist to be read, not to gather dust." That night, 3 women took books to their rooms. Helene read Heine by lamplight until her eyes ached, tears streaming down her face as she encountered beauty and complexity she had been told didn't exist. That had been systematically destroyed by the regime she had served. Liesel read Mann, losing herself in prose that reminded her of what German culture had been before the madness. Greta read Goethe and thought about her students, about what they had been taught and what had been hidden from them. 2 weeks into their stay, the first real crisis emerged. It started at breakfast, when Thomas mentioned casually that President Truman had given a speech about post-war reconstruction, about building democratic institutions in occupied Germany. "Democracy," one of the women, Hannah, who had remained mostly silent, said bitterly in German. "They pretend their system works, but it's weak. corrupted by money and criminals. Helene translated, her voice uncomfortable. Thomas set down his coffee cup carefully. What makes you think democracy is weak? He asked. Anna, emboldened by frustration and homesickness, responded in broken English. We were taught. Democracy makes people soft. No discipline, no order, no strength. I see. And your system, with its order and discipline, where did it lead? The question hung in the air. Anna's face flushed. Around the table, the other women looked down at their plates. They all knew where it had led. Defeat, destruction, their country in ruins, themselves prisoners in a foreign land. But knowing and admitting were different things. Anna stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly. You do not understand, she said, switching to German, the words tumbling out. You did not see what we saw. The chaos after the First War, the hunger, the shame. Our government gave us order, gave us pride, gave us purpose. Helene started translating, but Thomas waved her quiet. He had understood enough from Anna's tone and body language. He stood too, not aggressively, but meeting her intensity with calm. Sit down, please. Anna sat, but her posture remained defiant. Thomas took a breath, choosing his words carefully. You're right. I didn't see what you saw. I can't fully understand what the previous war did to Germany. But I can tell you what I do understand. Any system that requires burning books, silencing dissent, and conquering neighbors to maintain itself is not strength. It's fear masquerading as power. He paused, letting Helene translate. Real strength is admitting when you're wrong. Real discipline is controlling your worst impulses, not indulging them. Real order comes from consent, not coercion. Democracy is hard and messy and frustrating. But it's built on the idea that humans have dignity and rights that no government can take away. Anna was crying now, though she tried to hide it. Then why did you win? She whispered. If your way is so weak, why did we lose? Thomas sat back down, his voice gentler. Because your regime spent its strength on destruction. We spent ours on production. Your leaders demanded sacrifice unto death. Ours demanded sacrifice toward victory. Your system could only survive through conquest. Ours survived through cooperation. He leaned forward. And because, at the end, your system turned on its own people. We saw it in the camps, in the prisoners locked away by their own side. A government that fears its own people is already defeated, even if the final battle hasn't been fought yet. Silence filled the kitchen. Anna wiped her eyes. The other women sat frozen, processing this confrontation. This moment where everything they had believed was being challenged, not with propaganda, but with measured, logical argument. Finally, Greta spoke softly in English. How do we know your way is true? How do we know this is not also lies? It was the most important question she could have asked, and Thomas respected her for asking it. You don't, he admitted. You can't know by me telling you. You can only know by observing, thinking, and deciding for yourself. That's what democracy means, trusting people to think, to choose, to govern themselves. It's terrifying for those who want control. But it's the only system that treats humans as fully human. He stood, gathering dishes. Work starts in 30 minutes. Think about what I've said. Agree or disagree as you see fit. But think. The weeks that followed brought gradual, almost imperceptible changes. The women continued working, bringing in the harvest, preserving food for winter, maintaining the farm. But something had shifted in how they moved through space, how they interacted with Thomas and each other, how they thought about their situation. One afternoon in late October, Thomas took several of the women into town for supplies. The trip itself was significant, allowing prisoners this freedom was unusual, but Thomas had gotten approval based on their exemplary behavior and his supervision. Lancaster was a small Pennsylvania town, prosperous in a modest way, its main street lined with shops displaying goods that seemed impossible to the German women. Food in abundance. Clothes in multiple sizes and colors. People moving freely, buying what they wanted without ration cards or restrictions. They stopped at a general store. The owner, Mr. Peterson, had been skeptical about the prisoner program, but greeted Thomas warmly. When he realized the women were German prisoners, his expression tightened briefly before his basic decency reasserted itself. They helping with your harvest, Thomas? Yes, hard workers, all of them. Peterson nodded, studying the women with open curiosity. Well, welcome to Lancaster, ladies. Hope you're being treated right. The interaction was brief, but its impact was profound. Here was an ordinary American, showing basic courtesy to enemy prisoners. Not effusive warmth, but human recognition. It contradicted everything they had been taught about American hostility toward Germans. As they left, Liesel whispered to Helene in German. He was kind. Why was he kind? I don't know, Helene answered honestly. But Thomas, understanding the question if not the exact words, said, because kindness is ordinary here. It doesn't require orders or propaganda. People are just decent to each other most of the time. In early November, as the harvest wrapped up and winter approached, Thomas began a new routine. After dinner, he invited any interested women to join him in the study for what he called discussion evenings. Not lectures, not re-education, but genuine conversations about history, politics, philosophy, whatever topics emerged naturally. The first evening, only Helene and Greta attended, cautious and uncertain. Thomas had them read a passage from Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He had found a German translation, and then open discussion. What strikes you about this passage? Helene spoke first. He says democracy can lead to tyranny of majority. This seems like criticism. Exactly. Thomas leaned forward, engaged. Tocqueville loved democracy, but also saw its dangers. Real intellectual honesty means acknowledging the weaknesses in systems you support. Can you imagine your regime's authors being published if they criticized the leadership? The question answered itself. Of course they couldn't imagine it. Such criticism would have been dangerous, possibly fatal. Over subsequent evenings, more women joined. They read Jefferson, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass. They discussed the American Revolution, the Civil War, the labor movement. Thomas never proselytized, never demanded agreement. He presented ideas, asked questions, and let them think. One evening, Anna, who had challenged Thomas so angrily weeks earlier, raised her hand hesitantly. I have question, she said in careful English. If democracy is good, why did America have slavery? Why did they need war to end it? Thomas smiled, pleased by the question. Because democracy is a process, not a perfect state. The Constitution's ideals that all men are created equal are betrayed by slavery. It took war and sacrifice to force America to live up to its own principles. Democracy's strength isn't that it's perfect, but that it contains mechanisms for self-correction. But people died, many people. Yes. And that's democracy's great cost. Freedom means freedom to be wrong, to do evil, until enough people recognize the evil and demand change. Authoritarian systems prevent small evils through control, but enable enormous evils through absolute power. Democracy allows small evils, but contains mechanisms to eventually confront and correct them. Anna sat back, thinking. Later that night, Helene found her writing in a journal something Thomas had provided to all the women, encouraging them to document their thoughts. What are you writing? Helene asked. I'm writing that I was wrong, Anna said quietly. Not about everything. Maybe not about most things, but about some things. And I need to remember which things, so I don't forget when we go home. December brought snow and cold, and a deepening of the bonds forming in the farmhouse. Thomas decorated for Christmas, not elaborately, but with simple dignity. A tree in the parlor, candles in windows, evergreen boughs over doorways. On Christmas Eve, he invited the women to attend midnight services at the local church with him. It was optional, he emphasized, but all 7 chose to go. The church was packed, warm with bodies and candlelight, the air thick with hymns and incense. The German women sat in a pew near the back, hyper-aware of their status as prisoners, as former enemies, as outsiders in this intimate community gathering. But then something extraordinary happened. During the service, the pastor announced that there were guests present, German prisoners working in the community, and invited the congregation to welcome them in the spirit of Christmas and Christian charity. A moment of silence. Then, slowly, people began turning in their pews, nodding toward the Germans. Some smiled. An elderly woman reached across the aisle to squeeze Liesel's hand. A farmer Thomas knew leaned over and whispered, "Glad you folks are here. Merry Christmas. After the service, in the churchyard, people approached. Awkward at first, unsure what to say, but motivated by genuine curiosity and seasonal goodwill. Mrs. Yoder, the chaperone who had been so skeptical, brought homemade cookies. Mr. Peterson from the general store offered holiday greetings in broken German he remembered from his grandfather. Greta stood in the snow, accepting these small kindnesses, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. These were not the savages and gangsters of propaganda. These were farmers and shopkeepers and grandmothers. People whose lives paralleled those she had known in Germany. People capable of hatred, but choosing kindness. People practicing the principles their democracy preached. Back at the farmhouse, Thomas served hot cocoa, and they sat in the parlor, the tree lights glowing softly. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marguerite, the youngest, broke the silence. "Why do you do this?" she asked Thomas in halting English. "Why do you treat us like people? We were your enemies." Thomas set down his cup, considering his answer carefully. "Because you are people. That's not complicated. The regime you served tried to divide humanity into categories superior and inferior, worthy and unworthy. I reject that completely. You're human. I'm human. That's all that matters for how we treat each other." But we believed in it, Marguerite pressed. In the regime. In what they taught us. We believed Americans were bad, that democracy was weak, that our way was right. How can you forgive that? "I don't need to forgive your beliefs," Thomas said. "I need to give you the opportunity to examine them. You believed what you were taught, because that's what humans do. We believe our teachers, our leaders, our communities. But you're capable of learning new things, of seeing evidence and changing your minds. That capacity is what makes you human. I'm simply providing the environment where that can happen." Helene, her eyes bright with unshed tears, spoke in German. "You're giving us back our humanity. That's what you're doing. We lost it somewhere, serving that system. And you're giving it back by treating us as if we never lost it." Thomas didn't understand all the words, but he understood her tone, her emotion. "You never lost it," he said gently. "It was just covered over with fear and lies. It was always there waiting." In January, a letter arrived that would change everything. It came from the War Department, addressed to Thomas, marked official. His heart sank as he opened it, expecting bad news: termination of the program, investigation of his methods, something that would end what had been built here. Instead, it was a commendation. The regional administrator had been so impressed by the reports from Lancaster, the prisoners' cooperation, their apparent transformation, Thomas's innovative approach, that he was recommending the farmhouse model be studied and potentially replicated. Their apparent transformation, Thomas's innovative approach, that he was recommending the farmhouse model be studied and potentially replicated. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, reading the letter 3 times, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he went to find the women, working in the barn where they were organizing equipment for spring planting. "I received a letter from the War Department," he announced. The women froze, fear evident in their faces. Official letters meant changes, meant disruption, possibly meant their removal from this place, where they had found unexpected safety. "It's good news," Thomas continued quickly. "They want to study what we're doing here. They think it works. What does that mean?" Helene asked cautiously. "It means you're not going anywhere. It means we continue as we have been. And it means that maybe other prisoners will get the same opportunity you've had, to be treated as humans, to learn through experience rather than coercion." The relief in the barn was palpable. These women had come to value this strange sanctuary, this farmhouse where a widowed teacher had offered them not just shelter, but genuine respect. The thought of losing it, of returning to standard internment, had become frightening. That evening, Greta asked if she could speak with Thomas privately. They sat in his study, the room that had become sacred to her, where books offered worlds she thought had been lost, where conversations challenged everything she thought she knew. "I need to tell you something," she began in her improving English. "When I came here, I believed you were the enemy. I believed America was corrupt, weak, without real culture. I believed democracy was a lie that hid a system as cruel as any other." Thomas nodded, not interrupting. "Now I know those beliefs were wrong. Not because you told me so, but because I have seen the truth, I have lived it. You treated us with dignity when you had no reason to do so. Your neighbors welcomed us at Christmas when they could have hated us. Your system of government is messy and imperfect, but it is built on respecting individual human worth in a way our system never was. She paused, gathering courage. I want to tell you that I understand now. I understand what we supported, what crimes were committed in our name, what we refused to see because it was easier to believe the lies. I cannot undo my part in it, but I can acknowledge the truth, and I can commit to living differently because of what I have learned here. Thomas felt his throat tighten. This was what education truly meant, not forcing beliefs, but creating conditions where people could think freely and reach their own conclusions. Greta had done exactly that, and her transformation was more meaningful because it came from her own reflection, not his preaching. Thank you for telling me that, he said quietly. I'm proud of you, for your courage in questioning what you are taught, for your honesty in admitting you were wrong, for your commitment to growth. Those are the hardest things humans can do. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came the knowledge that the arrangement could not last forever. The war had been over for nearly a year. German prisoners would be repatriated soon. The women would return to a destroyed Germany, to uncertain futures, to communities that might not welcome those who had been captured. In April, the official notice arrived. All German prisoners would begin repatriation in May, processed through military channels, sent home in organized waves. The Lancaster women would leave by mid-May. The news brought complicated emotions. Germany was home, and they longed to see families, to return to familiar landscapes. But the farmhouse had become home too, in a different way. It was the place where they had been allowed to think freely, to read forbidden books, to question without punishment. Leaving meant returning to whatever chaos and reconstruction awaited in Germany. Thomas announced the news at dinner, his voice steady despite his own complicated feelings. Over 6 months, these women had become real to him, not prisoners or students or subjects in an experiment, but individuals he genuinely cared about. Their departure would leave the farmhouse feeling empty again, as it had after Margaret's death. We have 5 weeks, he said. Let's use them well. Those final weeks were intense with preparation. Thomas helped each woman draft letters to potential employers in Germany, providing references that emphasized their reliability, intelligence, and capacity for growth. He helped them practice English, knowing it would be valuable in occupied Germany. He gave them books to take home, slim volumes that could fit in their bags, tangible reminders of what they had learned. On their last Sunday, the church held a farewell service. The congregation had come to accept these German women as part of their community, and now gathered to send them home with prayers and well wishes. Several women spoke, thanking Lancaster for its kindness, acknowledging what they had learned, promising to remember. When Helene stood to speak, her English had improved dramatically from 6 months earlier. We came here as prisoners and enemies. We expected punishment, maybe cruelty. Instead, Mr. Mitchell gave us something more powerful. He gave us the space to think, to question, to learn truth from experience. He treated us not as enemies, but as humans capable of growth. This has changed us. We return to Germany different from when we left. We return with understanding that democracy, messy as it is, respects human dignity in ways we were taught it did not. We return grateful, changed, and committed to building something better. The congregation applauded. Mrs. Yoder, who had been so suspicious at the start, was openly crying. The final evening, Thomas prepared a special dinner, all the women's favorite dishes from their time at the farm. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the moment, the warmth of the kitchen, the easy conversation that had developed over months of shared life. After dinner, Thomas called them into the study one final time. I have something for each of you, he said. He distributed packages, one per woman. Inside each was a book different for each, selected personally, based on what he had learned about their interests and needs. And inside each book, a handwritten letter. Greta opened hers later that night. The book was Mann's The Magic Mountain, and the letter read, Dear Greta, you came here believing lies and leave knowing truth. That transformation required courage, the courage to question, to admit error, to change. Never lose that courage. Germany will need people like you in the years ahead. People who can think critically, who value truth over comforting lies, who understand that real strength lies in admitting mistakes and choosing better paths. You have that capacity. I've watched it develop. Use it well. You will always have a place in my home should you need it. But more importantly, you carry within you the principles that make any place a home: integrity, compassion, and commitment to truth. With respect and affection, Thomas Mitchell. She read the letter 3 times, then carefully tucked it into the book's pages. It would cross the Atlantic with her, survive the chaos of occupation, remain with her for the rest of her life, a reminder of the teacher who showed her that transformation was possible. The army truck arrived on May 15, 1946, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The women loaded their bags, heavier now with books and small gifts from townspeople. They stood in a line on the porch, where they had first arrived 8 months earlier, looking at the farmhouse that had become sacred space. Thomas stood facing them, hands clasped, his expression carefully controlled. He had said goodbye to students many times over his career, but this was different. These women had trusted him with their most fundamental beliefs, had allowed him to guide their transformation. Their departure felt like losing part of himself. "Remember what you learned here?" he said simply. "Not just the ideas, but the method. Question everything. Seek evidence. Value truth over comfort. Build the Germany that should have existed, one that respects human dignity, one that values thought over obedience." Helene, tears running down her face, stepped forward and embraced him. It was a shocking breach of propriety for 1946 Pennsylvania, but Thomas returned the embrace without hesitation. One by one, the other women did the same, each offering thanks in German or English, each carrying memories that would shape the rest of their lives. Greta was last. She held Thomas's hands and said in English that was now nearly fluent, "You saved us. Not just from camps, but from ourselves, from the lies we believed. I will never forget that. I will spend my life honoring what you taught us." "You saved yourselves," Thomas corrected gently. "I just provided the space. The courage was all yours." The truck pulled away, dust rising behind it. Thomas stood on the porch, watching until it disappeared around the bend in the road. The farmhouse behind him was suddenly completely empty again. He went inside, walked through rooms that would never again hold those particular voices, that particular energy. In the guest bedrooms, the beds were made with military precision, a final gesture of respect for the man who had shown them dignity. On his desk in the study, he found an envelope. Inside, a letter signed by all 7 women. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, words are insufficient for what you gave us, but we must try. You showed us that democracy is not weakness, but strength, the strength to trust humans with freedom. You showed us that kindness is not naivete, but wisdom, the wisdom to recognize our shared humanity. You showed us that education is not indoctrination, but liberation, the freedom to think and choose our own paths. We arrived as prisoners of war. We leave as students of truth. We came believing lies. We leave knowing at least some of what is real. We entered your home as enemies. We depart as friends. Germany is broken. But we carry within us seeds of something better, planted in your farmhouse, nourished by your teaching, ready to grow in German soil. We will build the country that should have existed, one that values truth, respects dignity, chooses freedom. This is your legacy, carried by 7 women across an ocean, planted in the ruins of our homeland. It will grow. We promise you this. With eternal gratitude, Helene, Greta, Marguerite, Liesel, Anna, Clara, and Irmgard. Thomas sat at his desk, reading the letter repeatedly, allowing himself tears he hadn't shed since Margaret's death. He had dedicated his life to teaching, believing that education could change the world one mind at a time. These 7 women proved it could. The women scattered across occupied Germany, but they stayed in contact with each other, and with Thomas through letters that crossed the Atlantic for decades. Greta returned to Hamburg, found her parents alive in the ruins, and eventually became a teacher herself. She specialized in history and critical thinking, raising a generation of German students who learned to question authority and value truth. She never spoke publicly about her time at the Lancaster farmhouse, but her teaching methods emphasizing evidence, encouraging debate, treating students as capable of independent thought echoed Thomas Mitchell's approach perfectly. Helene settled in Munich, worked as a translator for American occupation forces, and eventually joined the Foreign Service of the new Federal Republic. She spent her career building bridges between Germany and the United States, work she traced directly to those months in Pennsylvania. Anna, who had been so resistant initially, became a social worker in Frankfurt, dedicating herself to helping displaced persons and refugees rebuild their lives. When asked what motivated her work, she would say simply, "Someone showed me kindness when I deserved only justice. I'm paying that forward." Each woman, in her own way, carried forward what they had learned. Not through grand gestures or famous acts, but through daily choices to value truth, respect dignity, and recognize shared humanity across divides. Thomas Mitchell continued teaching until his retirement in 1963. He never remarried, never repeated the prisoner program, it ended after the war, never sought publicity for what he had done. When reporters occasionally approached him about the German women experiment, he would decline interviews, saying simply, "I was a teacher doing what teachers do, providing conditions for learning." They did the hard work, but in his study, carefully filed, he kept every letter the women sent him over the years. Letters announcing marriages, births, new jobs, accomplishments. Letters describing the new Germany emerging from ruins, sometimes frustratingly slow to change, but changing nonetheless. Letters thanking him again and again for that year, when 7 enemies became students, when prisoners became friends, when transformation proved possible. When Thomas died in 1979, his will specified that all letters from the German women be donated to the Lancaster County Historical Society, with instructions they be made available to researchers studying post-war reconciliation and re-education programs. Today, those letters are among the Society's most requested materials. They document something remarkable, not just that former enemies can become friends, but that education grounded in respect and truth can transform even the most deeply held belief.